Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. 10 minutes, that was roughly how long Helen Lambie was away from the flat on Queen's Terrace in Glasgow. Long enough to run a simple errand on a dark December evening, and somehow long enough for her employer, 82-year-old Marion Gilchrist, to be brutally murdered inside her own home. More than a century later, the case is remembered not only because the killer escaped, but because another man lost 18 years of his life for the crime. Marion Gilchrist was wealthy, independent, and intensely private. She lived in a comfortable first-floor flat with Lambie, her longtime domestic servant. Gilchrist owned valuable jewelry, fine clothing, and investments. She was also said to be deeply concerned about burglary. The doors were kept secured, and visitors were not simply admitted without question. That caution makes what happened on the evening of December 21, 1908, especially difficult to explain. By then, Glasgow was already deep into winter darkness. Inside the flat, Marion settled into her usual evening while Lambie prepared to go out for errands. Nothing about the arrangement seemed dangerous. Lambie would be gone only briefly, and the front door would be locked behind her. There was no expectation of a visitor, no planned appointment that investigators could later confirm. Just an elderly woman, alone for a few minutes in a home she believed was secure. Lambie left at around 7 o'clock. The exact sequence that followed has been examined and re-examined for generations because the available window was remarkably small. Whoever killed Marion had to enter the building, gain access to the flat, attack her, search at least part of the room, and leave before Lambie fully returned. If the estimate was right, all of that happened in approximately 10 minutes, and there was no obvious sign that the door had been forced, so let's pause there. A cautious woman is alone behind a locked door. The killer appears to enter without breaking it. That suggests a key, an unlocked door, deception, or recognition. Perhaps Marion admitted someone she knew. Perhaps she opened the door after seeing or hearing something reassuring. Whatever the explanation, the murderer seems to have crossed that threshold quickly and without creating the kind of damage police would expect from a stranger forcing his way inside. Downstairs, a neighbor named Arthur Adams heard a heavy noise from above. Concerned, he went up toward Marion's flat. Around the same time, Lambie was returning. The details of who stood where and precisely when they saw the departing man would later become crucial. What is clear is that a man came out of the flat and moved away through the building. He did not remain to offer an explanation. Within moments, Marion was found inside. The room showed signs of violence and disturbance. Marion had been struck repeatedly, suffering fatal injuries to her head. The weapon was never established with certainty, though investigators believed a heavy object from inside the home may have been used. There was no time to save her. The quiet errand Lambie had expected to finish in minutes had ended with her employer dead, a stranger disappearing down the stairs, and a confusing crime scene waiting behind the door. Now here's where it gets strange. Marion kept considerable wealth in the flat, and valuables were visible or easily accessible. Yet jewelry and other expensive possessions remained behind. Drawers and belongings appeared disturbed, but this did not resemble a careful, successful robbery. The one item reported missing was a diamond crescent brooch. That detail would soon dominate the investigation, even though it was not immediately clear whether the brooch had been taken that night or misplaced earlier. There were witnesses, but their accounts did not fit neatly together. Lambie saw a man leaving. Adams also encountered or observed the departing figure. Outside, a teenage girl named Mary Barrowman saw a man hurrying away from the area. Each sighting was brief and occurred under stressful, imperfect conditions. Their descriptions differed in important respects, including the man's appearance, clothing, and apparent build. At first, police did not have one clear portrait. They had several uncertain impressions. That matters because eyewitness memory is not a recording. A person glimpsed on a stairway can look different from the same person seen outdoors. Lighting, distance, fear, and expectation all shape what gets remembered. Later conversations can shape it again. In this case, witnesses were repeatedly asked to identify someone they had seen only briefly. Their eventual confidence would carry enormous weight. But confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. That problem sits at the center of everything that followed. Police searched for a man connected to a crescent-shaped diamond brooch. Before long, their attention turned to Oscar Slater, a German-born immigrant living in Glasgow. Slater dealt in gemstones and moved around the edges of respectable society. He gambled, used more than one name, and associated with people the authorities viewed suspiciously. To investigators looking for a plausible outsider, he seemed to fit a convenient profile. Then they learned he possessed a pawn ticket for a brooch. On the surface, that sounded powerful. A diamond brooch was missing from a murdered woman's flat, and a gemstone dealer had recently pawned a brooch, but the connection fell apart under basic examination. Slater's brooch was not Marion's crescent brooch. It had a different design. And records showed it had been placed in pawn before the murder. It was later recovered. The ticket did not link Slater to Marion, the flat, or the killing. Even so, suspicion had already begun gathering around him. There was another detail that looked incriminating when separated from context. Soon after the murder, Slater left Scotland for America. Police treated the journey as flight, but evidence indicated that his travel plans had existed before Marion was killed. He had booked passage and was not secretly disappearing in the middle of the night. He also traveled under another name, which fueled suspicion, though he had used aliases before. None of that proved he knew Marion or had entered her home. By the time Slater reached New York, Scottish authorities wanted him returned. He could have fought the process for longer. Instead, he chose to come back and face the allegation. Apparently believing the weakness of the brooch evidence would become obvious. It was a dangerous act of confidence. Slater expected that records, dates, and the physical difference between the two pieces of jewelry would clear him. Instead, once he returned to Scotland, the case shifted away from the brooch and toward identification. Witnesses were shown Slater under procedures that would be considered deeply problematic today. Rather than being placed in a carefully controlled lineup with similar-looking men, he could be made to stand out. Some witnesses had opportunities to see him before formal identification. Accounts of the departing man had already circulated, and not every witness expressed the same degree of certainty. Yet by the time of trial, the prosecution presented identification as a meaningful link between Slater and Queen's Terrace. There was still no physical evidence placing Slater inside Marion's flat. No stolen property belonging to her was found in his possession. No bloodstained clothing connected him to the attack. No reliable evidence established that he knew Marion, knew her routine, or knew Lambie would be away. The prosecution had to build its case from circumstances: the disputed sightings, Slater's journey to America, his aliases, his occupation, and aspects of his private life that could make him appear disreputable. The absence of forced entry created another difficulty. If Slater was a stranger to Marion, why would she admit him? If he had somehow obtained a key, where did it come from? If the door had been left unsecured by accident, the timing required astonishing luck. The killer arrived during a tiny window, acted quickly, and left before being trapped by Lambie's return. That pattern could suggest knowledge of the household. The prosecution never produced convincing proof that Slater possessed such knowledge. Slater went on trial in Edinburgh in May of 1909. The atmosphere around the case was already hostile. He was foreign-born, Jewish, and portrayed as a gambler and immoral outsider. Much of what the jury heard about his character had little direct connection to Marion's death. But character can become a substitute for evidence when a defendant is easy to dislike. The question quietly shifts from, did this man commit the murder, to, does this seem like the sort of man who might? The defense attacked the brooch theory and challenged the reliability of the witnesses. The pawn records were clear. Slater's brooch had been pawned before the murder and was not Marion's. His planned departure also weakened the claim that he had suddenly fled. But the prosecution emphasized the identifications and invited the jury to treat a collection of suspicious circumstances as one coherent story. The gaps were not filled with direct proof. They were filled with assumptions about who Oscar Slater was. Scotland did not require a unanimous jury. Slater was convicted by a majority verdict, with 9 jurors voting to convict and 6 refusing to do so. That division tells you something important. Even inside the courtroom, after hearing the prosecution's full case, a substantial portion of the jury remained unconvinced. Still, the majority was enough. Slater was sentenced to death. For a man who had voluntarily returned to clear his name, the result could hardly have been more catastrophic. The death sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, sparing Slater from execution but not from punishment. He was sent to Peterhead Prison, harsh institution on Scotland's northeastern coast. There he would remain year after year, continuing to insist he was innocent. The outside world moved on. Witness memories aged. Evidence grew harder to test. Marion Gilchrist's actual killer, assuming Slater was not that man, had escaped during those few minutes in 1908 and was never caught. Doubts did not disappear with the verdict. Lawyers, journalists, and legal observers began examining the record. One of the most persistent was the writer and criminologist William Ruffhead. The case also attracted Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle was not claiming to solve Marion's murder. His argument was narrower and in a way more devastating. The evidence used against Slater was too unreliable to support a conviction, especially one that had nearly ended in execution. In 1912, Conan Doyle published a detailed examination titled The Case of Oscar Slater. He focused on the contradictory descriptions, the flawed identification process, the unsupported assumptions surrounding the brooch, and the prosecution's use of Slater's character. He argued that investigators had formed a theory too early and then interpreted later information through it. Once Slater became the suspect, facts that pointed away from him were minimized, while ordinary or ambiguous behavior was made to look sinister. That pattern is sometimes called tunnel vision. It does not require every investigator to act dishonestly. It can begin with a plausible hunch followed by growing commitment. Evidence supporting the hunch feels important. Evidence contradicting it feels mistaken or irrelevant. In Slater's case, the false brooch connection should have weakened suspicion. Instead, the investigation continued as though the original lead had revealed something essential about him. The theory survived even after the central object behind it was shown to be unrelated. Campaigners also questioned whether all useful witness information had been handled fairly. Earlier uncertainty did not always match the confident version later placed before the jury. Statements that complicated the prosecution's narrative were not given equal force. The result was a case that looked stronger in court than it did when every inconsistency was placed side by side. Still, appeals and petitions failed for years. Slater remained in prison while the argument over his conviction became a long-running public controversy. Prison took more than 18 years from him. That span is easy to say and difficult to imagine. Seasons passed behind stone walls. The First World War began and ended. Governments changed. The city where Marion had died continued transforming. Slater entered custody in his 30s and emerged in his 50s. Throughout that time, supporters continued pressing for review. Their concern was no longer simply that the evidence was weak. It was that the justice system seemed unable to correct a verdict it had become invested in defending. By the middle of the 1920s, political pressure had grown. A message from Slater reached the journalist and politician Thomas Johnston, who helped bring renewed attention to the case. Questions were again raised in public and in Parliament. Eventually, the demand for action became impossible to ignore. In 1927, Slater was released from prison. Freedom, however, did not automatically restore his name. Legally, the murder conviction still stood, so the campaign moved towards securing a formal appeal. A change in Scottish law created a route for the case to be heard again. In 1928, the Court of Criminal Appeal reviewed Slater's conviction. The court did not declare that it had identified Marion's murderer, and it did not need to. It examined whether Slater had received a lawful and properly directed trial. The judges concluded that the original trial judge had misdirected the jury, particularly in the way damaging character evidence and the prosecution's circumstantial case had been presented. The conviction was quashed. After more than 18 years in prison, Oscar Slater was legally cleared of Marion Gilchrist's murder. He later received compensation, though no payment could return the years taken from him. His relationship with some campaigners became strained, including disagreements over money and expenses. That uncomfortable aftermath does not change the central fact. The case used to imprison him had not been reliable enough to stand. The legal system had corrected the verdict, but only after an extraordinary delay. And that brings us back to Marion. Correcting Slater's conviction did not solve her murder. Investigators never established who entered the flat, why Marion admitted that person, or whether robbery was truly the motive. The missing crescent brooch may have mattered, but the valuables left behind make the scene difficult to read. The disturbance could have been a hurried search, an attempt to disguise another motive, or the result of interruption. Any stronger conclusion would move beyond what the evidence can support. The witness descriptions leave the same uncertainty. They may reflect one man seen from different angles or memories altered by stress and later suggestion. The killer may have known Marion personally, known something about her valuables, or simply exploited an unlocked door at the right moment. Each possibility has been debated, none has been proved. Naming another suspect without firm evidence would repeat the mistake that defined the case, taking fragments, arranging them into a story, and mistaking that story for certainty. So the case endures in two parts. There is the unsolved murder of Marion Gilchrist, an elderly woman killed in the supposed safety of her home. And there is the wrongful conviction of Oscar Slater, built from uncertain identification, prejudice, and circumstances stripped of context. 10 minutes on Queen's Terrace destroyed one life and redirected another for nearly 2 decades. The court eventually answered whether Slater's conviction could stand. It never answered the question that came first: who killed Marion Gilchrist? If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.